Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This essay is a psychoanalytic cartography of late capitalist subjectivity, structured around Slavoj Žižek's concept of surplus enjoyment and the paradoxes of desire in a world where nothing is forbidden and everything is permitted. It unfolds in 9 recursive movements, each building emotional, ethical, and philosophical tension without resolving it, because resolution in this framework would betray the very condition being explored. Desire collapses not through repression, but through abundance. The superego no longer forbids, it insists, encourages, and optimizes, whispering that failure lies not in wrongdoing, but in not thriving visibly enough. What follows is not liberation, but a subtler form of cruelty, the demand to glow, to enjoy correctly, to perform a meaningful life in the absence of narrative gravity. This is not a work of original theory. What follows is a tonal and structural meditation built from Žižek's philosophical framework. His ideas on enjoyment, subjectivity, cynicism, and superegoic pressure are not just cited but staged. The form is recursive because the logic it performs is recursive. The insights are Žižek's. The contradiction is his. The structure is designed to inhabit, not explain. Everything was permitted, that was the problem. He could scroll all night, pause, buy, watch, archive, return. There was no locked door, no withheld experience, no voice saying no. And because there was no limit, there was no shape. Pleasure became wallpaper, possibility became blur. The more available it was, the more it slipped through. He expected adulthood to hurt in meaningful ways, and it does. Not this. A quiet nausea, a strange weight behind the ease. The ability to do anything quietly dissolved the will to do anything. This wasn't repression, it was vertigo. To live in a world without refusal was to live in a world without proportion. He could go anywhere, but why would he? A society that promises everything delivers nothing slowly. The collapse of prohibition had once felt like a victory, now it felt like an erasure. The symbolic structure that once made joy feel earned or even illicit had turned into a series of notifications. The gate was always open. Desire requires a red light to press against, otherwise it flickers out. He thought about how pleasure used to have an edge, a sequence, a ritual. Now it was just available, flattened into the feed, queued behind a tap. He wasn't choosing anymore, he was confirming. And somewhere in that gap, between confirmation and want, he began to notice the first fracture. The ritual pursuit had been replaced by the demand to enjoy without tension. The only thing more exhausting than not getting what you want is being told you should be grateful for always getting it. The absence of the forbidden made every gesture feel hollow. He tried listening to music he loved. It felt pre-played. He ordered food he craved. It arrived like a repetition of something already metabolized. The very ease of the transaction drained it of meaning. He missed friction, he missed effort, he missed wanting, and then he saw it. It wasn't that he had everything, it was that nothing resisted him, and without resistance there was no curve, no pull, no drama to desire. The joy he longed for wasn't hidden, it was erased by abundance. But that wasn't quite it. Something deeper had gone missing, not just the shape of pleasure, but the structure that gave it height. Without limits, there was no elevation. Without elevation, no fall. Without fall, no gravity, and so everything floated, everything was permitted, but nothing hurt enough to make it matter. The superego did not vanish with the collapse of authority. It evolved, it smiled, it encouraged him to be his best self, to hydrate, to manifest, to rise and grind. The cruelty was not in the reprimand, but in the tone. It no longer punished transgression, it punished insufficiency. It whispered through apps and slogans, through wellness and productivity. You have everything, so why aren't you radiant? The old guilt had structure. It came from parents, priests, teachers. This new guilt was ambient. It had no source. It came from inside, yet not quite. It came from the internalized demand to be both fulfilled and improving, relaxed and optimized. It came from the gaze of 1,000 imagined observers he had trained into himself. A quiet jury with endless stamina. He realized the voice in his head was no longer his own, or rather, it was, but only because he had spent years rehearsing what others might expect. He wasn't being watched. He was watching himself, constantly. Even rest had become surveillance, even idleness had to be earned. Buy the right tools, follow the right advice, meditate for at least 11 minutes, watch something inspiring, get steps, get sleep, journal. But don't just do it meaningfully. Be present, be grateful, be better. The command was never just to enjoy, but to enjoy well, to make your enjoyment legible to an imagined evaluator. Even desire had become performative. He bought new headphones thinking they would help. They did. For 2 days. The sound was cleaner, then it wasn't. He downloaded an app that measured breath, then another that corrected posture, then a timer that suggested micro-pleasures. But none of these devices could touch the edge he had lost, the friction that once gave pleasure its shape. The tools calibrated his life but dimmed its contrast. He was improving, but less and less of him wanted to be improved. There was no one punishing him. That was the brilliance of it. He punished himself for not flourishing fast enough, for feeling tired despite access to everything. He punished himself for the absence of gratitude, for not turning abundance into joy. That failure, quiet, non-criminal, purely effective, was the mark of the superego's success. What was once sin became latency. He wasn't guilty of doing wrong. He was guilty of not being radiant under perfect conditions. That was the structure, and he knew it wasn't his fault, but he couldn't forgive himself anyway. The demand to enjoy had become indistinguishable from the structure of suffering. This wasn't asceticism, it was a subtler violence. He was not to abstain, he was told to glow, to radiate balance, insight, productivity, joy. And in failing to do so, he felt a guilt deeper than moral failure, the guilt of emotional misperformance. He looked at others and saw the same quiet dread, not in their words, in their eyes, in the pauses between enthusiasm. They spoke of burnout as if it were a technical hiccup, not a structural wound. I just need a reset, a better morning routine. I'm trying this new breathing method. But the exhaustion came from the performance itself, from being caught in a system that rewarded only visible, aestheticized joy. He wanted to scream, but even the scream would feel curated, like content, like brand extension. There was no rebellion in it, only proof that he was still playing the game. Žižek had said the true cruelty of the superego was not prohibition, but the command to enjoy. But this was worse. It was the mandate to enjoy in a way others could admire. Private pleasure had become performative, and performance had become endless. He watched people he admired turn themselves into brands, their laughter filtered, their rest posted, their gratitude algorithmically legible. Even their vulnerability came with a CTA, share if this resonates. Suffering was no longer hidden. It was stylized, marketable, safe, and yet he didn't blame them. He was doing it too. He began to wonder if pain still had a place. Not crisis, not trauma. Those were still permitted if beautifully expressed. But raw, unedited dread, boredom, inertia, these were taboo. Not because they were bad, but because they couldn't be used. The market had no use for a man who simply could not feel. So he turned inward, looking for the source of numbness. Was he depressed, disconnected, entitled? None of the labels quite fit. The deeper truth was more elusive. He wasn't broken. He was functioning precisely as instructed. He had internalized every soft demand, obeyed every invisible cue, and was left with a version of joy that felt like starvation. What used to be guilt now felt like fatigue, not the kind that sleep fixes, the kind that accumulates over years of trying to glow for systems that only wanted his trace. He wasn't unhappy, he was used, and the worst part was that he had used himself. The cruelty wasn't in the suffering, it was in the fact that he couldn't even name it as suffering anymore. He tried to anchor himself in projects, to give the day a spine, to summon meaning through commitment, not because he believed in the work, but because belief itself had become irrelevant. What mattered was structure, something to push against, something to be shaped by. He didn't need passion. He needed pattern. The symptom emerged slowly. A compulsion to write, though he had nothing to say, a fixation on lists, a return to rituals that didn't soothe, but marked time. It wasn't joy. It was geometry, a way of carving shape into the blur. Without the symptom, he drifted. With it, he endured. He had read enough to know the truth. We don't want what we say we want. We want the thing that keeps us wanting. The project was never meant to finish. It was meant to hold. Completion would ruin it. He built frameworks knowing they would never be filled. He didn't need them to succeed. He needed them to persist. And yet, there was a flicker of shame in this knowing. The structure had become self-conscious. He knew the project wasn't real, that it was a containment device. But the knowledge didn't dissolve its power, it only deepened the dependence. He wasn't building anything anymore. He was maintaining the illusion of purpose. Still, it worked. When he stopped, the days unraveled. There was no narrative, only events. Without the scaffolding, time collapsed into undifferentiated duration. The calendar filled itself with placeholders, calls, errands, maintenance, but the absence of a through line made even survival feel incoherent. He wasn't proud of the symptom, but he wasn't ready to live without it. He feared the empty day more than the failed one. Even boredom was preferable to drift. The project gave him a reason to decline invitations, to set alarms, to delay pleasure. It gave shape to refusal, and in a world where everything was permitted, that was its own form of power. He sometimes dreamed of letting it go, just walking away. But the thought filled him with panic, not freedom. The project, however meaningless, was a form of coherence. It wasn't about legacy, it was about structure, about not floating off the map. The symptom didn't heal him, it contained him, and that was enough. He could no longer locate himself inside his own narrative. There was no arc, only noise. The symptom had held for a time, but its edges were fraying. He began to sense that what he clung to was not identity, but the echo of an earlier coherence. Something once felt whole, not anymore. Desire no longer propelled him, it circled him, teased him, refused him the urgency that once shaped action. He wasn't tired, he was unstuck. And in that unsticking came a strange clarity. He had mistaken movement for meaning. The symptom didn't complete him, it preserved him. But now even preservation felt excessive. He stared at his calendar. Everything was still there, tasks, reminders, recurring rituals, but none of them drew him. He kept the structure intact out of inertia, not need. The failure wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, a dulling. The realization that the thing which once kept him alive no longer recognized him. Žižek had written that the subject emerges through lack, but what if the lack stops functioning? What if it no longer generates movement? The absence of meaning used to produce desire. Now it produced only stillness. He wasn't driven by contradiction. He was suspended in it. He began deleting things, files, notes, bookmarks, not out of liberation, but to make silence visible. He needed fewer inputs, fewer proofs of previous selves. Each deleted item felt like a small wound and a minor relief. He wasn't shedding identity. He was making space for something he couldn't name. He tried sitting with it. No projects, no substitutions, just the echo of the failed structure. The discomfort was immediate. He felt useless, then guilty, then nothing. The nothing stayed. It wasn't peace. It was weightless. A voice inside him asked, "Now what?" Not out of curiosity, out of reflex. As if something else should follow. As if life needed a next, but nothing answered. No instinct, no image. The loop had broken. This was not rock bottom. It wasn't even despair. It was the absence of narrative gravity. The symptom had failed to hold him, and the only thing he could do was wait, without pursuit, for something not built on repair. Truth didn't arrive as revelation. It arrived as tone, a flicker, a change in the rhythm of a sentence, not a new insight, an old one spoken differently. He had spent years chasing insight as content, missing that its form was already saying everything. He watched a scene from a show he'd seen a dozen times, but this time the silence between lines felt louder than the lines. He read an old text he had bookmarked for brilliance. The ideas hadn't changed, but something in the cadence felt truer. Truth was never in the claim, it was in the pressure the claim exerted. Žižek had said, the most unbearable truths aren't hidden, they're spoken constantly, just without being heard. Not because they're too abstract, but because they don't land, they don't shake the sentence. But when they do, the whole structure vibrates. He thought about the figure of the fool, the one who tells the truth, not as critique, but as comedy. Not because the truth is funny, but because it cannot be digested without absurdity. Humour made truth survivable, not lighter, just bearable. There was no epiphany. Only a smirk, a shrug, a line that lingered too long. He began to trust moments that couldn't be explained, a tremble in the voice, a misplaced phrase, a look away at the wrong time. These weren't interruptions, they were structure revealing itself. Every break in polish was a kind of fidelity. The symptom was gone, the project had dissolved, but traces remained, not in plans, but in tone. He started writing again, not to finish something, to hear himself. The goal was not coherence. The goal was echo, a rhythm that said, "You are still here." He reread an old notebook, half sentences, false starts. He didn't remember writing them, but they felt like coordinates, not to anywhere specific, just to movement. They didn't make sense, but they felt right. Like hearing a note from a song you didn't know you missed. This wasn't healing. It wasn't repair. It was attunement, a recognition that truth was less like a destination and more like a harmonic. Something you feel before you understand. Something you return to, not because it solves, but because it sounds like you. He no longer believed in conclusions. He had chased too many, each promising finality, each collapsing into repetition. What endured wasn't the insight, but the pattern it left, the rhythm of its return. He wasn't seeking answers now, he was listening for motifs. Some days began with stillness, others with noise. He no longer judged the difference. Structure mattered more than meaning. A cup placed in the same spot, a walk without urgency, a sentence reshaped slightly. These gestures did not promise transformation. They marked time, they tethered him. He remembered how the essay began, not this one, the one he lived inside. Everything was permitted, but the ache hadn't vanished, it had become form. Form was the only thing that survived contradiction, not because it was immune, because it absorbed. Žižek never offered a way out, only a better map of entrapment. But that was something. To know the loop, to learn its texture, to find rhythm in the glitch. He didn't need to escape repetition, he needed to learn its grammar. He no longer asked what the project meant, he asked how it moved, whether it returned in 3 beats or 4, whether the echo landed clean or cracked, whether silence fell on the downstroke. These were the questions now. Structure had gave him something to return to when sense failed. He didn't believe in the story. But he could believe in the beat. And so he practiced the return, not to closure, but to coherence, not to clarity, but to contour. The day didn't need meaning, it needed phrasing. The loop didn't need to break, it needed to bend. The wound didn't need to close, it needed rhythm. He was not wasting his life, he was still composing it. Everything was still permitted, but now he knew how to disobey.